Hi. So I'm going to do just like a little quick introduction just to sort of set up this conversation and then hopefully leave a bunch of time for conversation and questions. So as you heard, I spent most of my life as a professional poker player, but I actually started my adult life at the University of Pennsylvania doing my PhD work in cognitive science for the National Science Foundation Fellowship. And at the end of my work there, as I was going to go off to become a professor, I got sick. I landed in the hospital for 2 weeks, and I needed to take some time off. And during that time off, I found out that the fellowship goes away when you leave school, and I needed money. And my older brother actually suggested that I start playing poker in the meantime, just to kind of bridge the gap until I went back out on the academic job market. Well, the meantime turned into 18 years-ish, which is, I'm sure, exactly what the National Science Foundation had in mind. What was that sound? Which is, I'm sure, exactly what the National Science Foundation had in mind when they gave me that fellowship to go study cognitive science. But then in 2002, I got asked to come and speak to a group of options traders about how poker might inform risk. And that was the first time that I really thought about, in an explicit way, what the interplay was between what I was doing in studying cognitive science, and specifically I was studying how people learn in noisy systems, and how that related to what I was seeing at the poker table. And I realized at that moment that I hadn't really left academics. I had just landed in a much better laboratory for actually studying the kinds of questions that I was really interested in that drew me to academics in the first place. So I'm going to do a few slides before we get to this great conversation to hopefully kind of set up what it was that I was really kind of thinking about around how it is that we deal with feedback. Because the primary question that I always wondered was that when I was in graduate school, I was taught that learning occurs when there's lots and lots of feedback tied closely in time to decisions and actions, which seemed really reasonable to me at the time. And then I started playing poker, which is a game where there's lots and lots of feedback tied closely in time to decisions and actions. And I saw that people were actually quite poor at learning in that environment. And that was kind of the primary thing that jumped me off to trying to think about why that is and what that tells us about human cognition and how we might solve it. So, does anybody want to tell me what the situation is here that I've got up on here? Anyone? Call it out?
Yes. New England won.
New England won. I know, everybody's so bitter, right? Yeah. So this is the very last play of the Super Bowl in 2015. This is Super Bowl 49, and as you can see, the Seahawks are on the Patriots' 1-yard line. There's 26 seconds left. It's 2nd and goal. What you don't see here is that the Seahawks have exactly one timeout. That's an important factor. And there's an expected play here. Everybody's expecting that Pete Carroll's going to call for a handoff to Marshawn Lynch, one of the greatest short yardage running backs of all time. Marshawn Lynch will try to get in, and then if he fails, maybe they'll try that again. Pete Carroll does something different, as you'll see. He calls a pass play. We're going to watch the play quickly, but what I want you to listen to is the commentary that comes after it, particularly from Chris Collingsworth. Oh, whoops, sorry. Wait, go back, play that.
Play clock at 5. Pass is intercepted at the goal line by Malcolm Butler. Unreal.
They try to pick play, Al. They tried to go here, but he beats them to the punch, and I'm sorry, but I can't believe the call.
Me neither.
I cannot believe the call. You've got Marshawn Lynch in the backfield. You've got a guy that's been borderline unstoppable in this part of the field. I can't believe the call.
It's got to be one of the dumbest calls offensively in Super Bowl history.
Okay. So obviously in the moment they're not feeling very favorably about this call. The dumbest call in Super Bowl history, that's pretty incredible. It's Pete Carroll. I think we can all agree he's a pretty good coach. But this is clearly the way that people are processing this in the moment. But the question is, okay, well maybe we can forgive them because they're having to do it on the fly. What happens when people have a little bit of time to think about it? And what you can see is it doesn't get better. These are just sort of 5 sample headlines from the next day, and you can see it's a battle of, is it the worst play in Super Bowl history or just the worst call in NFL history? period. This seems very unkind to Pete Carroll. Now, during that week, Pete Carroll was on, I think it was Good Morning America. It's in my book. It might have been the Today Show. And he was pressed to admit this horrible, egregious error that he had made, and admit that it was indeed the worst call in the history of the game, apparently. And you can see that the emphasis is mine, but what he says is it's the worst result of a call ever. Now, he adds the call would have been a great one if we catch it. It would have been just fine, and nobody would have thought twice about it. So let me talk about the second part of what he says in a second, but let me talk about the first part, which is actually quite insightful. So what he's willing to admit is that there was a disastrous result. But what he's not willing to admit here is that the call itself was disastrous. So let's just think just really quickly about the mathematics of the call. Remember, Pete Carroll only has one timeout. So we've got a clock management problem when you've got 3 possible plays, but only 26 seconds left. So we can build out a decision tree pretty quickly to see that if he hands it off to Marshawn Lynch, if Marshawn Lynch fails to score, the only way for him to stop the clock is to actually call and burn that time out. And there's going to be a lot of time that gets run off that clock in the process. And if he is going to get 2 more plays at it, they would have to then be pass plays, because that's the only way for the clock to naturally stop. So if he starts off with a handoff to Marshawn Lynch, the only way for him to hand the ball off to Marshawn Lynch twice would be to only do those 2 plays and no other. So he has to give up a 3rd play in order to go for the handoff first. If he does want to hand it off to Marshawn Lynch twice and he calls the pass play first, if the pass play is incomplete, the clock stops on its own, and it does it very quickly. He still has the timeout in his back pocket, and guess what he gets to do? He gets to go back to those 2 run plays anyway. So if your goal is to hand it off to Marshawn Lynch twice, by passing the ball first, you actually get 3 tries at the end zone instead of 2. Whereas if you hand it off to Marshawn Lynch at first, you can either only do that twice, or you have to run 2 pass plays instead. Okay, so essentially you can think about it as an option. He is preserving the option to be able to hand the ball off to Marshawn Lynch twice. So the question is, what does that option cost? The cost of that option is the interception rate in this particular case. It hovers around 1%. Does that seem like such a bad decision to anybody anymore? Not really, I hope. Anybody still think it was the crappiest decision in Super Bowl history? You do? Are you an options trader? Right, okay, so this is pretty simple options theory going on right here. So what happened here was when he failed, everybody decided that they could work backwards from the quality of the outcome to the quality of the decision. Why? Because they didn't really understand the decision, all right? And this is what we call resulting, which is the tendency, particularly when a decision is confusing or it's not immediately obvious to us whether the decision was good, to work backwards from the quality of the outcome to the quality of the decision as if somehow you can derive that. And you can see that actually if I think I can just go back to can you go back to the previous slide real quick? We can see that if we look at this second part of what he says, which I actually disagree with. If he says the call would have been great if we catch it, it would have been fine and nobody would have thought twice about it, I actually really disagree with him there. So let's think about it. Let's just do the thought experiment really fast. He does this crazy play and he throws the ball and they catch it for the game-winning touchdown. Do you think everybody just goes, meh? What do you think the headlines look like the next day? Brilliant call. Right. But we know that once he's made the call, everything else is a matter of luck. None of it has to do with him. And in fact, interestingly enough, we don't need to do the thought experiment because we had it happen in this year's Super Bowl. So now we're once again on the Patriots' 1-yard line. But now it's the Eagles playing the Patriots. It's the end of the second quarter. 38 seconds left, it's 4th and goal. So obviously there's only one play here. Philadelphia's up by 3. And for anybody who knows about football, there's a few things. One is there's an expected play here, which is just to go for the field goal. But mathematically, being up by 6 isn't that much better than being up by 3. What you really want to do is be up by 7. So in order to get up by 7 here, they're going to have to try to go for it and try to score the touchdown. Okay, so same situation. We have an expected play. In one case, it was handing off to Marshawn Lynch. In this case, it's going for a field goal. In both cases, the coaches do something unexpected, which is they pass the ball. And interestingly enough, you're going to see the pass goes to literally the exact same spot in the end zone. And now I want you to listen to what Chris Collingsworth says. Oh, whoops, I did it again. Can you put it back in? Sorry, that's my fault.
4th and goal. And they're going to snap it, and it's Trey Burton who throws caught. Foles, touchdown.
Here we go. They've got all these signals. Shotgun, he would not have been eligible but for the fact he was in the shotgun, not under center. And there's the old basketball player. They talk about Nick Foles. He's more comfortable playing quarterback like a point guard, and here he is receiving the pass that is going to be shown a billion times.
So that's a pretty good example of resulting. In one case, you have an unusual play that doesn't work out, and Chris Collingsworth is saying basically that Pete Carroll's an idiot. And in the second case, you have a very similar play that works out fine, and he's saying, this is so amazing. That's so crazy how awesome that is. So this resulting is really coming from the fact that when we think about the way that we think about the connection between decision quality and outcome quality, we act like we're playing chess. But what we're really doing is playing poker. So let's think about in chess, like I'm just going to pick on you. If I play a game of chess against you and I lose, what can you say about my decision quality in relation to yours? Not as good, correct. So notice in chess, I can work backwards pretty well, right? If I lose, we can say something about how good my decisions were. But what if I play a couple hands of poker against you and I lose? What do we know about my decision quality? There's luck involved, so we don't know. That's exactly right. So what happens is that when we're playing chess, we have a much more clear connection between outcome quality and decision quality, so this kind of working backwards is okay. But when we're playing poker, it's not, and life's decisions really look like poker, in fact, academically so. So when we look at the definition of the game of poker, poker is a game of decision-making under conditions of uncertainty over time. Let's not worry about the timepiece too much, but what are the two sources of uncertainty in poker? Well, it's coming from luck, right? There's just turn of a card, and then also hidden information. There's a lot of information asymmetry. I know what my cards are, I don't know what your cards are, and vice versa. So because of those two forms of uncertainty, what happens is we start to pull apart the relationship between outcome quality and decision quality, such that for any given decision I make, there's always a cloud of possible outcomes that could occur. Now, there's only one outcome that can occur, and we tend to overfit when we're trying to figure out what we're trying to learn from that outcome, and overfit the one outcome of the many to what we can derive about our decision quality. Now, if we think about the definition of game theory, it actually lines up pretty well with this definition. Game theory is the study of decision-making under conditions of uncertainty over time. And that's because I've got John von Neumann up here. John von Neumann, very famous economist. He was the mentor of John Nash, who's the Nobel laureate, who was schizophrenic. Russell Crowe played him in A Beautiful Mind. John von Neumann did a whole lot of stuff in his life. He was the father of the modern computer. He also ran the Manhattan Project. He's responsible for the concept of mutually assured destruction. And while he was running the Manhattan Project, he had a little moonlighting going on with Oscar Morgenstern, writing a very important book called The Theory of Games. And this is when we really started thinking from an economics perspective, how do you make decisions under conditions of uncertainty in groups? Now, why does poker align so well with the definition of game theory? Well, because von Neumann actually based game theory on the game of poker. And not only that, he was asked by one of his colleagues, how come you didn't base it on chess? And von Neumann points to exactly this problem that makes resulting such a bad thing in life. He said chess isn't even a game, it's just a calculation. And what did he mean by that? That you're removing the luck element mostly from chess. Nobody's rolling the dice and taking your bishop off the board. The pieces are going to stay where they are until someone moves them on purpose. And we're really removing the hidden information piece as well. I can see your whole position. So therefore, with enough computing power, I should be able to brute force that game to the end. Not so in poker. future. And that's why we know that poker is a very good place to start studying how is it that people learn, and how does the noise in the system that's pulling apart of decision quality and outcome quality really get in the way. So I'm going to stop there so we can hopefully jump into this great discussion. Actually, let me see if I've got, oh, can you put that last slide back up just real quick? Whoa. There we go, thank you. I just want to put this last slide back up because I just want to think about, this is just a nice visualization for us to have, where we can think about any decision we make as a bet, because a bet isn't just like obviously what you do in a casino. It's something that's informed by your beliefs. Beliefs go into two categories: facts, like the earth is round, and predictions, like the earth will be round tomorrow. Those are two different types of beliefs. Our beliefs are uncertain because they're generally informed by, in the case of facts, incomplete information, and in case of predictions, incomplete information and the influence of luck. And that any decision is putting us toward a set of possible futures, not just one possible future. So we can think about this frame of a bet that poker can really kind of inform in order to think about our decision making. So I just want to put that little graphic up there.
Great.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, Annie, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you now help people make better decisions.
I try to.
Is that as fun as poker, where you're trying to force people to make dumb decisions?
So actually, I have to say, it's like a lot more fun, I think. So, poker's this weird thing. I think about it like if I were trading on the floor in '82, I think it's very similar. Like there's these very few things where I'm looking right at you as I take your money.
Right.
And then you have to hand it to me as opposed to like across a computer screen or in some way that's like sort of separated from us. And poker is sort of like this last vestige of that kind of interaction where you're physically trading with each other. And what ends up happening is that by the definition of poker, for it to be fun for you, it also has to have the ability to hurt you. Right? Like it's no fun if you're playing for pennies, right? Unless pennies really, really matter to you for some reason. So what that means is that when people lose, they're actually like in pain. And so this kind of zero-sumness, like I take from you, you take from me, that then, because we're facing each other, causes me to actually have to look at you as you're in pain, means that very often when you're sitting at a poker table, you're not necessarily interacting with the very best versions of the people that you're sitting with. Because everybody has good versions of themselves and bad versions of themselves, right? I have like the very best Annie and kind of like the cranky, not so happy Annie.
Right.
And I really want to interact with like the really great, awesome, happy version of you. So when I go in and I do trainings on decision making with companies, or I come in and do this kind of thing, which is either a fireside chat or a keynote, or I'm working with someone on an executive on personal coaching, I'm almost always interacting with the best version of that person, and I love that.
Right. And I assume that growing up as you did, so your brother is a professional poker player. You also, childhood friend Eric Seidel, he mentioned in the book, one of the winningest poker players of all time. I think you said he had over $30 million.
Over 38, I think he's over 39 now, $39 million.
So, not only with your own accomplishments, but in terms of your background, probably one of the deepest kind of poker foundations you can think of. How has that helped in terms of making decisions in life in general, and maybe more specifically about on the investing side or personal finance?
So I think that this idea of like how are you dealing with the feedback that you're getting is really important. I'm going to divide it into two broad categories. One is that you really have to face down the emotional effect on the path that you've recently been on. So let me just put a pin in that for a second. But the other is that this piece of you really have to understand that whenever you make a decision, after you make the decision, there's just a lot of outcomes that could possibly occur. And you have to be very, very embracing of uncertainty. I remember somebody asked me once, well, if you're a poker player, you should be able to tell me how I can become more certain. And I said, no. As a poker player, what I'm going to tell you is to be really uncomfortable with the fact that there is uncertainty. Start to embrace it, and instead of asking, am I sure, ask, how sure am I? And it's a very, very different question. And what's really wonderful about taking this approach of how sure am I, as opposed to am I sure, is that you're constantly holding your beliefs and predictions loosely. with the ability to act on them in a very decisive way. So I'm 62%, that's enough for me to actually decide. But because I'm 62%, now I'm going to go and try to figure out, should I have tweaked that? Like, how was my modeling of that? What's beautiful about living in that uncertainty is that when we think about these sources of uncertainty that kind of trip us up, the presence of luck and hidden information, well, once we really embrace uncertainty, we really start to get a very clear and objective view of how much luck is influencing things, which makes us better forecasters. But also on the hidden information side, we start to become really hungry for information. And particularly, we start to become hungry for views that oppose us. Because we kind of already know why we're right. But if we're really asking this question of like, how sure am I, as opposed to am I sure? Well, how sure am I cannot be answered unless I start thinking about why I might be wrong. And that's really like the construct of a bet. If you say to me, you know, do you want to bet on it? What does it cause me to do? It causes me to ask that question, well, I don't know, how sure am I? And then there's a cascade of questions that come, what do I know? Why do I think this? How much luck might be involved? What do you know that I don't know?
What are the odds?
What are the odds? Why might I be wrong? I mean, there's this whole series of questions that causes you to take an incredibly open-minded stance to views that disagree with you.
So one of the things I think that a lot of people struggle with is, I don't know whether it's innate or something that people just grow up with over time, but you can think of it from an evolutionary standpoint. If you're, you know, in a cave with your clan, and there's a predator comes in trying to attack you, the person who is there, you know, with the condition of uncertainty, is there an animal here? Is it going to attack me? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. So they got eaten, and the people that survived over human history were those who just made a decision quick. Worst case scenario, if they were wrong, they left and they lived another day. So what exactly do we kind of, if you think of us as the evolutionary leftovers of all these years of conditioning, how do we even begin to reverse that?
So you just mentioned my two favorite things, which is type 1 errors and why we evolved for type 1 errors, and then you also mentioned tribe. And the solution is in that piece of tribe. So if we think about from an evolutionary standpoint, what did we get rewarded for? Well, we got rewarded for two things. One was making type 1 errors, meaning a false positive. You hear a rustling in the grass, you run away. You don't sit there and go, is this a lion? Because the people who went, is this a lion, are dead, and their genes never got passed on. So we really have this tendency to be true believers, to just sort of believe what we hear, and then maybe go back and vet it later, right? So we feel like the way we form beliefs is that we hear something, we think really hard about it, and then we form a belief. It's actually we hear something, we believe it, and then we go back and maybe at some later date, if we're forced to, we might vet it. But that happens pretty rarely. Okay, so that kind of sets up the problem, is that we have these biases like resulting, which is really trying to create certainty where none exists. Motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, hindsight bias. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of these, and this is just kind of the way our brains were built. There were good reasons in terms of the survival of our genes when we lived in tiny, small clans for that. Now, the other thing that we're really built for is tribe. So a lot of our energy goes into building these big brains, which means that not very much of it goes into how fast we are, or how big our claws are, or how big our teeth are. So what was our advantage against animals that were much stronger than we were? Well, we banded together in these small kinship groups. And we have this incredibly strong drive toward tribal affiliation. We can see it in politics very strongly. But it was supposed to be these tiny little kinship groups, and those tribes gave you basically four things: moral closure, which I won't worry about too much, but let's think of the three things that are really important: a sense of belongingness, a sense of distinctiveness, and then also a sense of, it gave you epistemic closure, meaning it closed, there's all this uncertainty around our beliefs, it told you what was true and what wasn't, so it offered you the certainty that you crave. So I'm a big believer, don't overcome your evolution. because you can't take your brain out of your head and like install a new operating system. You're kind of stuck with what's in your head. But what you can do is figure out, well, if this tribal affiliation is so strong, maybe I can create tribe that actually aligns better with what my long-term goals are. So I can create tribe around, we're the people who are really epistemically open, like we're really open-minded, and we're really good mistake admitters, and we're really good at listening to other people, and particularly those who disagree with us, and really trying to ponder how do we create great steelman arguments and red team ourselves and think about why we're wrong, which all runs somewhat naturally against our evolution. But the lucky thing is that the strongest drive is tribe. So when I was playing poker, Eric Seidel, who I had been friends with for a long time, it was a long time into our friendship before he was like my peer. And I went up to him and I was complaining to him about a hand I lost. And all poker stories go the same way. I had a really good hand. I was a mathematical favorite, and I lost. I'm sad. Wah, wah. So it's called a bad beat story. You all have them too. Anyway, I went up to try to tell him a bad beat story, and he said to me, I don't want to hear it. And I was like, I'm sorry, like I thought you were my friend. Why don't you want to hear it? And he elaborated. He said, because if it's really due to luck, there's literally nothing to be learned from it. So why are you telling me that? Like, that's the stuff that isn't in your control.
I think he said something like, don't you know I have my own sob stories? Like, why are you even
telling
bothering?
me this? Like, I have my own emotional baggage out of like some hand I just lost that I'm trying to deal with myself. Like, don't unload yours onto me. But he did follow it. And
I'll try that with a client sometime.
Yeah, he said, if you have a question, if you're wondering if you played the hand correctly, then I'm all ears. So what did he do? He told me what it took to be in his tribe, right? I wasn't allowed to complain. I had to be a truth seeker. I had to ask him about, how could I have done better? Did I make a mistake? How could I think about this hand in a different way? What was the learning that could occur from it? Now, here's where the belongingness and distinctiveness really becomes important. I wanted to belong to his tribe. And we do all want to feel distinct. So yes, to belong to his tribe, I had to do this kind of painful thing of going up and saying, I think I really butchered this decision. But when I was walking through a poker room and I heard other people doing like I can't believe I got so unlucky, and that guy was such an idiot, and that was so sad, and none of it was my fault, it was all just bad luck. And I heard that kind of talk, I felt distinct. I felt like I got that whole tribal affiliation. And what they did was, in a top-down way, forced this more open-minded stance on me. Now, I just want to say, I was bad at it. It's because it's hard, but I was better at it than I would have been. And everybody that was sitting in my little truth-seeking tribe was also bad at it, but better than we would have been. And those little changes in how often you're willing to explore mistakes, how often you're willing to be open-minded to other opinions, make all the difference in your outcomes.
So now let's say we get to a point where we've surrounded ourselves with the right people, we've, to an extent possible, worked on ourselves, established an ability to think in bets. So now it comes to the time of actually investing. So of the people who you know, whether it's yourself or other people, who successfully think in bets, what do their portfolios actually look like? Is it all passive and diversified across like a huge range? Are they taking concentrated active positions? Like, what does it actually look like in practice?
So first of all, it depends on the person's values, which I think we never want to miss. Right? Which is just like, how risk averse are you? How much volatility are you willing to take on? Number one. Number two, in terms of are you passive or active? Well, that's a matter of opinion. So I myself am a passive investor who has someone who makes active investments for me, because I don't want to bet my own expertise, because there's people who are much better than I am at this. And so recognizing sort of what your own abilities are, and then go find someone who has better abilities than you if you feel like your abilities aren't so great. I think is super duper important. The thing that I worry about as we're thinking about what do our portfolios look like is a few things. The first is that I think that sometimes we're risk averse, not because we're actually naturally have a particular stance toward risk, but because we're afraid of how we're going to feel due to when the outcome comes. So the best way that I can sort of think about this is, if we think about this Pete Carroll play, where the obvious play was for him to call, the obvious play, which wouldn't be mathematically correct, was for him to call for a handoff. I just want to ask you guys, like, if he had called for a handoff and failed to score, do you think the headlines the next day would have been saying he was the worst coach in Super Bowl history? No. And I think this is really, really telling. So what happens is that when we have a lot of processing fluency around a decision, and processing fluency can come in a variety of ways because it's the thing that people always do. That would be the handoff. It's the status quo decision. It's simpler, like simpler decisions we have more fluency around than complex ones. When we change course, when we do something that's unusual or sort of against the grain, all of those things we don't have so much processing fluency around. And when that's the case, when the decision doesn't feel very transparent to us and we have a bad outcome, that's when all the blame comes to us.
Okay, Howard Mark, so I know it was on your book, he talks about career risk from an advisor standpoint.
That's right.
If you propose something that's against the grain and wrong,
now you have career risk.
Right.
Exactly. And it's true for people in general who are making their own decisions, is that we tend to be defending against the fact that people are going to result on us. And it puts us it distorts what are the kinds of risks that we're willing to take. So as an example, it might make us have a strategy where we're going to have lots and lots and lots of wins, but we might be losing to the strategy. It's just we're going to win 8 times out of 10, right? For example, it can drive us into mini-max strategies, for example, which aren't necessarily, sometimes those are fine, right? But sometimes what that means is that we're minimizing our maximum win along with that, just as an example. We're very likely to choose something where we feel like we have consensus. So we're driven to create false consensus in the room as opposed to truth-seeking consensus. Data can be used either to sort of cover us or to actually find some interesting truth in it. So I think that what we really want to watch out for as we're thinking about our own risk profile is how much of that is being driven by a need for sort of safety against the bad outcome, protecting ourselves against the downside, right? Versus that this is what our actual own preferences are for what we want our portfolio to look like. That's number one. Number two is that I think that we have a tendency also, because of sort of these feelings of regret, that very often when we have a winning strategy, we'll put too much into that basket. Obviously the huge, like you have 90% of your portfolio in one stock. That's a kind of silly way to end up. You can get that actually, you can end up there because of tax strategies, actually by mistake. But we don't really want to be doing that on purpose just because we feel like we should be pressing our winners, for example. Another is that this resulting problem really comes in. Something that's been working we think is more likely to be a good decision. Something that hasn't been working we're more likely to think of as a bad decision, and we tend not to really examine very well how much of that was due to luck or short-term variance, and we'll miss a lot of really good strategies because of that. But the reason why people end up investing in Facebook versus some other stock that's less well known is because if Facebook loses, it's like, well, what could I do? It's Facebook. And it's kind of the same reason. It's like, what could I do? I handed it off to Marshawn Lynch. That wasn't my fault. So those are the kinds of problems that I really think about. And how do you then sort of think about what you want that future to look like, where you can sort of get around that problem? And I think there's two things that you can do to do that. One is to do basically to work backwards from what you want your outcome to look like. So to imagine, it's 3 years from now or 5 years from now, and this is what my portfolio looks like. How did I get there? And to do it on the good side and the bad side. So in other words, my portfolio is up X percentage. Why did that happen? My portfolio is down X percentage. What happened over the last 3 years that got me here? That helps you get a little bit out of the kind of what's happening in the moment, what's status quo in the moment. It allows you to get kind of a better view. But the other thing I think is that you have to do some real work in order to free you up psychologically from this fear of the downside. And I think that a lot of that work has to do with what outcomes are you actually fielding in order to go back and look at process. And what we tend to do is have these all hands on deck, oh my God, we have to have a meeting when you have a loss. But when you have a win, you don't have that same all hands on deck meeting. So let's say that I'm a real estate investor and I invest in a property and the appraisal comes in low. Everybody's like, oh my God, how could we not have seen that coming? What's wrong with our model? Why did the appraisal come in so low? But let's say that I invest in the same property and the appraisal comes in an equally unexpected amount, high. When was the last time someone was like, oh my God, why were we so wrong? Why did that appraisal come in so high? Our model was really bad. So people don't do that. They just sort of like go, oh, look at that, I won. Of course, I'm great. It was a great investment. And they don't realize that unexpectedness is the problem, not whether you lose or win. I mean, this is something we really tried to do in our poker group, was try to, across wins and losses, be relatively blind to the win or loss and focus more on the unexpectedness. How is our forecast? Because if you're not doing those dives on the win side, now you're going to be missing opportunities. Like if I'm undervaluing the real estate market, I might miss opportunities to deploy capital in a way that would be really positive expected value. Along with that, when we do look at those downside events, we only ever ask one question: how could I have avoided it? We never ask, maybe I should have lost more. Maybe my position size was actually too small, right? When we win, we only ask, could I have done better? We don't ask, maybe I should have lost, I should have actually won less. My position size was ridiculous. It was way too big and I should never have won that much. Or maybe I shouldn't have won at all because the reasons that I thought it was going to win were totally orthogonal to the reasons that actually won. Once you start viewing that yourself through that lens, you start to become much less defensive of just the downside outcome. So a lot of this is kind of damage that we put on ourselves by only sort of examining and really doing these deep dives into the downside and only asking how we could have done better, at which point we don't want to be sort of subject to that kind of examination, and we start defending ourselves against the downside outcomes as opposed to just trying to be good forecasters of the future.
Right. And it's one of the interesting things about being either in a room like this or at a conference like this. So many prestigious speakers in particular, and unbelievably talented people across the board. I feel like a lot of these people have hopefully done the work to not only look at the times when they've made mistakes, but also look at the times when they've succeeded, because they've had a lot more successes than failures, and to learn equally from those.
Or redefine what a mistake is, right? I mean, just redefine it as not winning or losing, but just unexpectedness.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, a few years ago, Michael Mauboussin, who you know, and he's kind of at the apex of the stuff when it comes to investing, spoke here in 2014.
Oh, lucky for you guys.
Very lucky. And he used one of, I would say, the most popular quotes attributed to him, which is that there's an easy way to tell whether something's a game of skill. Can you lose on purpose? Yes. I think we actually have a tweet that came out. Can we put that up on the screen? So one problem with the quote is that it's yours.
It is.
And Michael Mauboussin sent this out a couple weeks ago. Did you have to have a word with him?
No, I didn't. He completely did this on his own. I actually saw the tweet that Trent Giffen had written, a very big blog post, and had attributed it to him, and he came in on his own. I wasn't going to correct the error because I didn't think it was Michael's error. So I just sort of let it go.
Well, he quotes you in the book actually as you, I think.
Yes, he does.
So what does it actually mean? So what does that quote actually mean? People say it all the time.
So one of the problems once we inject luck into a system is that we want to understand, are we losing or winning because of luck? In other words, how much influence is there of luck on the outcome? Because there's some things where the influence of luck is nearly 100%, like the lottery. And so we don't really want to be investing in the lottery, right? Because there's no skill in it. So the question is, when you're sort of in this muddy place, which comes when you inject volatility into a system, and you're trying to figure out, is there a real skill element that possibly I can advantage in order to invest in this system that has a lot of noise? You can just ask yourself a very simple question. Instead of trying to prove all the reasons that there might be skill in it, just say, can I lose on purpose?
So in investing, I would guess, you can lose on purpose over the long term. I think losing on purpose in the short term might be surprisingly hard, even if you bought very out of the money options or something very speculative. Within one day, you can make money on something. So is that fairly typical of games of uncertainty over time?
Well, it is, but it depends on what you mean by the long run. I mean, I can lose on purpose pretty well, and I can lose in a relatively short time in the stock market. I can invest in stocks. Let's say I only need a couple of months to be able to do this, and every time the market goes down, I can sell.
Okay.
Okay, I mean, like that. There you go. All right, now I can lose on purpose. Okay, so I just have to watch the ticker, and when the market goes down, I sell.
So
And then when it goes, so basically if I employ that strategy, and we know people employ that by accident. Right? Like, I'm sure there's a lot of people who have sold this week, like they're selling low and now they're going to come back and buy high. So, I mean, I could just literally do that, right? So in poker, I can lose on purpose to you. I can just fold hands when I think that I have the best hand, for example. Right? So that's really what you want to ask. If you think about something like the lottery, if I'm following the rules, I can't purposely lose more than you. I mean, assuming as long as we invest the same amount, we both buy our dollar ticket, and we follow the rules of filling out the ticket. And so what happens is that the reason why people sort of get confused by luck is that once you start to narrow the skill gap, in things like markets, you've narrowed the skill gap, and poker, you've narrowed the skill gap. The influence of luck in the short term starts to show through a lot more. You start to be able to really see the luck a lot more. So like the example that I give that he was actually pulling that from was if the Red Sox play a Little League team, they win 100% of the time. But if they play the New York Yankees, you need a lot of times in order to see it show through. And I think that that's what ends up confusing people, is that in poker, in the short run, we don't really know. But that's because our skill gap is going to be relatively narrow. And once you have a narrow skill gap with noise in the system, it takes a lot of iterations for the luck to show through. So that's why I like to do it the reverse and say, well, could I lose on purpose?
Too bad for Pete Carroll, the Super Bowl is in a best-of-7 series.
Yes, it is in a best-of-7 series. He would have done better, yeah.
Okay, well, I think we are out of time, so here we go,
Thank
Mo.
you so very much. Thank you, Jeremy.